Hello, my name is Rich Howard, owner of Architectural Builder Supply, and this video is to bring you a closer look at the Bommer part number LB4310-400-600. This is a spring hinge from Bommer. The LB stands for lube bearing, and when we have a 43 number after it, that tells us that it is a spring hinge. The next two digits specifically define the spring hinge in terms of its thickness, its pattern of screw hole locations, of how the corners of the hinges are treated, square or radius. Tells us whether the hinge is unusual in shape, kind of tells us what brand of door it may be used on, etc. Since there are so many different variants, let's just tell you where you can. There is actually a video below this video that will talk about all of the different hinge types when it comes to these LB4300 series hinges from Bommer. Moving past that in the part number, well, you know what, let's do this. Let's start to dissect the part number completely. So LB4310, that means that what we're dealing with is a spring hinge. That is the 4310. An LB hinge from Bommer is going to be a 3-knuckle hinge. Their spring hinges are 3-knuckle, like pretty much everyone's. It's a 3-knuckle hinge. 1, 2, 3. The 4310, however, specifically defines all of the treatments of this hinge, and let's go over that now. There is a link below this video to a document called Template that will allow us to review all of the particulars that make this a 10 in the 4300. That means that it's square corner. That means that the locations of the holes are considered template pattern. This is the very standard location for where these are going to be intended, or where they're located. The term template refers to this paper document that you could print out and hold. That's the template, the technical drawing. The term template also refers to this pattern. Template pattern on this hinge means specifically that hole is so far down and so far over. Regardless of who makes the 4-inch hinge, if it is a template pattern, those holes will always be in the same location. If it's template pattern. There are many patterns, especially the spring hinges, and that's where the 10 part number will change. Also tells us that the hinge leaf thickness is 96 thousandths. 0.096 is the leaf thickness. That makes this a residential grade hinge, which means that it is thinner than the standard hinge, which would be about 130 thousandths thick if it was commercial grade. And the good old caliper tells us 0.101. 0.101. A little bit of flare probably at the end of where that steel was sheared. Moving further into the part number, the 400, that specifically tells us that this hinge is 4-inch tall and 4-inch wide. It's very important to know that the dimensional properties of a hinge are that the first dimension is the height. You just have to memorize that. It's the opposite of how doors are. I'm not exactly sure why, but that's just the bottom line. The height is first dimension. Now, on a 4x4 hinge, it doesn't really matter if you don't understand which comes first, but it would be awfully important if you ordered a spring hinge that was 4.5x4, something like that. Okay, so be mindful. You could have one taller than it is wide. You could have other hinges that were wider than they were tall. Okay, especially if you're prepping a door and frame, you'll want to know the dimension is the first dimension is the height. That's the 400. You can do this in a 350, 3.5, 3.5. Now the 600 means two things. It means it's made of steel, and that it has a prime coat finish. Bommer's prime coat is this almond or tan type of color. Prime coat can also be red, most commonly gray, but by Bommer it's this color. Now there are some other other links down below this video. We're getting now into the, let's go through the certifications and hinge selection guide. This is a spring hinge, so obviously you want your door to be self-closing to some degree. Obviously you want it to be self-closing. On that hinge selection certification guide, there's a table that will show you how many hinges you should have depending on the size of the door, but really the weight. So if you're dealing with 4x4 hinges, which are probably on an 1 3/4 thick door, and you have a door up to 85 pounds, 2 hinges would be adequate. Door heavier than that, go three hinges. You can mix and match standard non-spring type hinges with spring hinges, as long as the leaf thickness is basically compatible. This spring hinge is going to work with those hinges that have a thickness from 0.085 to 0.109. You could not use a standard weight hinge with this residential weight spring hinge. They wouldn't be compatible because the thickness of the leaves and the geometry of the door opening, you would find that the door wouldn't swing very well. So be mindful that if you're doing just 2 spring hinges and your door has 3, be mindful that the thickness of that leaf is between that range. You should only have a ball bearing hinge, and you can do a ball bearing residential weight hinge. Make sure that it is ball bearing if possible, and that no matter what, it's mounted at the top. You want your spring hinges middle and bottom, for sure. The last location being the least desirable of all places to place the spring hinge, because spring hinges are really not load rated, and 70% of the door's weight is actually hung on that top hinge, doing the majority of the work. And you don't want a non-load rated item being used where all the load is being placed. So that's why you'll put your ball bearing hinge up at the top if possible. Now, I'm a fan of all spring hinges. Being LB hinges, these will do a fine job at carrying a load because of the design of their LB hinge. A very, very good quality hinge when it comes to carrying weight. I'm a fan of all spring hinges, and it's not because I'm a distributor of spring hinges as much as I find greater success when you have more spring hinges doing the job. Meaning, a spring hinge, in my opinion, is the least desirable way to close a door because you don't have control. It's not a control device. It's just a spring. The more you wind it up, the more it'll close. If you're installing this possibly onto a fire-rated door, or if you're installing it onto a gate around a pool, you really want to make sure that stuff latches. The fire door is required by code to latch. That gate is certainly required by code to latch as well, but more so of common sense, meaning pool enclosure, you don't want someone's child walking in. That gate's got to be latched. More spring hinges gives you more flexibility of having more reserve stored energy when the spring gets opened or the door gets opened to close. You open it, stored energy, you release it, the energy is released. I find that more spring hinges is akin to like a tugboat. They don't go very fast, but they can pull a lot of weight, like they have a lot of torque. When you get down to that crucial 10 degree of closing, like where you would normally have a latching valve control of a hydraulic closer, you don't have that with a spring hinge naturally. All you have is the remnants of the stored energy and inertia. You don't want to set the spring tension so high that you have to slam the door closed, because sometimes it'll slam closed and then bounce back open. And you want to be able to have flexibility to control or change the settings on the spring as environmental conditions change, as they would, of course, in the change of seasons. You'll have windows open in the summer and different requirements of stored energy in your spring hinges than you would in the middle of the winter. More spring hinges gives you more flexibility. A closer, you're going to be able to control that, whereas again with a spring, you're just hoping that you've got enough tension to get it to close, and do so without slamming, do so without being a danger to the users, and wear and tear on the door and frame. Slam, slam, slam. That's no good. So if you have to use spring hinges, consider the possibility of using more so that you can have better control. But if you've got a door safely under 85 pounds, and it's an interior door, like a bedroom door, and you just want the door to close because you don't want your cat going in there, 1 or 2 would probably be quite sufficient for the application. But where you have environmental stresses on it, be mindful, you might want more. That table will tell you the general generalities of what hinge to use. Also of note on here is that these are grade 1 hinges, meaning they've been tested to 1,000,000 cycles. You must have not less than 2 spring hinges to be compliant with fire code NFPA 80. Non-labeled doors, and that's up to 3070. Non-labeled doors can go to 4 foot wide, 7 foot 6 tall. Now, moving on to the installation instructions template, caution. If you're going to go to 90 degree, you can go 4 holes of tension, which we'll get to in a moment. If you're going to go past that, only 3 holes of tension. If you've set tension and you can hear the spring creak and you've got it set quite aggressively, be mindful that you're probably pretty close to breaking the spring. So you're going to want to back that off or maybe add a new spring hinge. Now, installation of the hinge is like any other hinge, except that you can't separate these leaves. So get this attached to maybe the door first, and then have someone help and assist, and then attach it to the frame after this is attached to the door, or however you work easier. Setting the tension on the spring. For every order that you place, you're going to get at least 1 tension rod. That's a black piece of metal. For every hinge that you order, you'll get at least 1 tension pin. When the tension collar is pointed in the up direction, okay, you'll insert it into the tension collar. These holes is where you'll insert it, and then you'll turn it clockwise. As I turn it clockwise, I reveal new additional holes. There's 1 hole, there's 2 holes. I can't get to 3 or 4. So you'll put the pin in 2, reset, and turn it over again, let's say. You'll, into that hole in the tension collar, insert the tension pin that's included. This order has 2 hinges on it, so you need 2 tension pins. These are non-handed. This can work as a left hand or a right hand. You'll always install it with the tension collar up according to the installation instructions. If you don't, I don't know what the long-term effect is on that, except that there's a reason that they put it in bold caution. If you were to install them upside down for whatever reason, just rotate that counterclockwise naturally, but follow the instructions. There's a reason, most certainly, that they put that there. I just might imagine it's the way the weight is going to hang on put stress on the hinge, and it's designed to be in this direction rather than in this direction, would be my guess. Okay, so just install the tension collar up. And we've just gone over how to set the tension on this, and then you'll adjust as necessary. The middle and bottom, work that area first. Be mindful of not using the factory supplied tension pin. I've had people tell me that they've hurt themselves on people using pieces of metal that have been cut in unintentional contact with the pin as it is projecting from the edge of the spring hinge, because it does stick out a little. I've got it stuck in there, and it does stick out a little, as you can see. So be mindful of that. Use the factory original pins. Screws are included. With this hinge, you'll get all wood screws and all machine screws for a hinge. If you have a particular need for screws, specify that in the comment field. This hinge comes with all wood and all machine, but generally, depending on the hinge, you might find all machine and half wood. So if you know that you're doing a wood door and wood frame, specify that so there's no confusion about what you're going to get in terms of the screws. No need to take a last-minute run to the hardware store to find screws that don't exactly work correctly. So specify that. Now, the extended description information that is below, let's go over it quickly. Full mortise, this is indeed a full mortise hinge. You can see from the swag on the hinge leaves, this area here and here, that when the leaves are brought parallel, they're meant to be mortised flush to the edge of the door and frame. This is UL listed for fire door installations and is, again, grade 1, 1,000,000 cycle rated. Not going to be able to see that on the camera. we'll endeavor to get a photograph added. Okay. Non-handed self-lubricating bearings, that's the LB construction. Easily adjustable spring tension, ANSI templated screw hole pattern, we talked about that. Pivot point aligns with a thin hinge. Made of steel, square corners, 96 thousandths, we measured 0.101. 8 holes per hinge. Number 10 by 3/4 wood screws, 1024 machine screws, no bigger than 3070, certainly if you've got NFPA 80 requirements. A link to the tension pin and tension rod are down below should you need those separately. And the last thing I'd like to point out to you is the Bommer logo. Right above it says Made in USA. The fact that Bommer is quite proud of, as am I to represent them. If you have any questions on the Bommer LB4310-400-600, and by the way, that 600, you change that into any other code and you'll get a different finish. This hinge is available in all of the common finishes that can be done on steel. Your brasses, your bronze, chromes, nickels, satin, polished, oil-rubbed bronze, bright black japanned, zinc coated, they can do that as well. So Bommer will certainly accommodate those requirements. Any questions on the LB4310 or any other Bommer product, please feel free to reach out to us. And thank you.